Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Centre for European Reform. I'm Ian Bond, I'm the Deputy Director of the CER, and I should start by saying that this meeting is on the record. It's being recorded indeed, so please bear that in mind for your comments or questions. We're delighted to be hosting this today, and we're very happy to have the support of the Seidel Stiftung, and I'll start by giving the floor to Richter from the Seidel Stiftung to say a word or two of welcome on his behalf.
Dear guests, dear colleagues, dear partners, it is a very great honor to welcome you to the first event of Seidel Foundation in 2025. It's also, please correct me if I'm wrong, the first post-election event of a German political foundation here in London. And it's also the first event of the Seidel Foundation since the handover from Anja Richter to me, Michael Richter. And it's very interesting. I just wanted to say a few words of welcome and the whole context that we are facing here, because we had a transition period with Anja Richter that started in November, on November 1st. And so when we started the transition period, Joe Biden was still the president. It was still before the elections in the United States. And I was going to bed in the first week still with polls showing a head-to-head between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. And then it was November 8th, we woke up. Donald Trump was basically announcing his victory in the presidential elections. But I said, at least we have a functioning government in Germany. Well, that didn't age very well, as many of you know. I came then back from the office. Of course, the number one topic in the office were the elections in the United States. Then in the evening, I come back, I open some websites and I see the traffic light was basically turned off. So as you know, the previous government in Germany was called the traffic light coalition. So the German government then collapsed. And I knew that those events on that day, they will significantly mark my tenure here as the head of the Seidel Foundation office in London. But it is, of course, our predominant mission and aim actually to make understandable, shed light on what is going on in global politics, especially also in Germany, to make understandable what is relevant here for the United Kingdom and what is relevant for Germany, to foster the bilateral discussion, bilateral ties, in order to foster a better dialogue and a better future for both our countries. And this is why I'm very, very grateful also to take over the great cooperation from Anja Richter with the Center for European Reform, because they say never change a winning team. And with the Center for European Reform, we have really done a fantastic job in the past to shed light on those developments, on what is going on. And I'm very delighted that this is our first event together. It is my first event as head of the London office. And I hope that you will leave this place here later on with much more answers than questions. So thank you very much. And now I hand over the floor to Ian.
Thank you very much. Well, no pressure then, if we have to leave with more answers than questions. Yeah, I mean, these elections are clearly going to have very important consequences, not just inside Germany, but for Europe and for the world, for the EU, for relations with the UK, for Ukraine, for transatlantic relations, which might not have been predictable. We know not a lot yet, I guess, about the coalition, other than that the dominant party in it will be the CDU-CSU, but there's clearly a lot to be negotiated there, and there's a lot to discuss today. I mean, I'm wondering, what exactly are these elections going to mean for German politics as well as German policy? We've seen big increases in support for Die Linke, which a few months ago was being written off as a sort of dying party of elderly nostalgics from the ex-GDR. We've seen a big rise in support for Alternative für Deutschland, which was predicted. But we're also seeing quite interesting polarization between young voters and old voters, with young voters voting for non-mainstream parties, and between the sexes, with young women voting disproportionately for Die Linke and young men voting disproportionately for Alternative for Deutschland. So that's one set of questions, is about what this means for German politics and beyond that policy. Then I'm interested in what does it mean for the relationship between the UK and Germany. Before the elections, the two governments had more or less finalized negotiations on a bilateral treaty. When I was in Berlin at the end of last year, what I heard was that there was pretty much cross-party consensus in Germany on the contents of this treaty, but it would have to be looked at afresh by a new government once it was formed. And I wonder whether that judgment still holds in view of some of the developments that we've seen in Europe and in transatlantic relations. And in terms of transatlantic relations, what impact is that going to have? I mean, I was extremely struck by Friedrich Merz's comments last night, which I think are worth quoting. He said, after Donald Trump's remarks last week, it is clear that this government, that's the American government, does not care much about the fate of Europe. My absolute priority will be to strengthen Europe as quickly as possible so that step by step we can really achieve independence from the USA. I mean, that's an amazing thing for a center-right German politician to say. And I wonder what it means for Germany's place in the EU as well. Olaf Scholz never seemed to me to be particularly interested in the EU. And I wonder whether Merz will now want to take on the mantle of leadership. And what will that mean for Franco-German relations? What will it mean for Germany's traditionally very Atlanticist security policy and for Germany and NATO? So to discuss this, we have an excellent panel, both here and online. And just to introduce them very briefly, on my extreme right, I was going to say, I don't know what I say.
Please don't.
But Christina Heuer is Deutschlandradio's correspondent in the UK and Ireland since 2020?
Yeah.
Yeah, so for the last 5 years, an interesting time to be here, I think. Christoph Meyer, Professor of European and International Politics at King's College London. You've been here rather longer than that, 2007, is it? Yeah, so a long time. And on my left, Dr. Marion Messmer, the Senior Research Fellow in the International Security Program at Chatham House for actually about the last 3 years, is it?
That's right, yeah, and I've been in the UK since 2013.
Aha, right, okay. So you've also seen quite a few changes. And then online, I'm delighted to welcome Markus Ferber, CSU MEP since 1994. Vice Chair of the European Parliament Subcommittee on Taxation Affairs, a member of the Committee on Economic and Monetary Affairs, and the President of the Seidel Stiftung. So welcome.
Hello.
I don't know whether the sunshine in the background is an accurate reflection of the weather where you are.
It is, absolutely. We have sunshine and blue sky in Bavaria, yes.
Excellent, always. So let me start with you. The CDU-CSU will be the largest bloc in the new Bundestag, but your vote share grew by significantly less than the vote shares of the AfD and Die Linke. And I wonder what lessons will Friedrich Merz draw from that? And in your own territory of Bavaria, I think the CSU even lost a bit of ground. So I wonder, what lessons are you? Well, maybe these figures are wrong, but I thought that according to the figures that I saw, you were going to have 1 seat fewer in the next Bundestag than in the current one. But so it may be very marginal. But I wonder, what sort of lessons are to be drawn from this?
Yeah, thank you very much, and I hope the technique is functioning properly. I had a little bit problems to join, but now it works, hopefully, and I hope you can hear me well. Starting with the side question, we lost 1 seat, but that has nothing to do that we lost votes. We won votes, but we have a new electoral system taking place this for the first time, which was adopted by the Traffic Light Coalition. and which is a 100% proportionate system, and is weakening those parties who normally win the direct seats, the constituency seats, which we do with the first ballot, and the second ballot gives them the proportionate indication. And this was changed 100% to the second ballot, the most important, and the first ballot losing its importance. And that's why we lost one seat, although we won on electorate and in percentages. That is one of these questions we have to address as well. But that is only a minor issue which has to be resolved. The big issue was that in the last weeks, after these horrible attacks we have seen in Chatham and in Munich, with asylum seekers, migration people who made horrible accidents against others, German people. That was the main issue, how to overcome migration. And there was a very interesting poll yesterday evening which showed that 55% of the German electorate say that CDU-CSU is responsible for these problems with asylum seekers, as that is linked, of course, with the era of Angela Merkel. And that is one of the main problems we are confronted with. We have to address, you know it from the United Kingdom as well. With or without being in the European Union, we have these problems on European level. And therefore, that was one of the key elements where the alternative for Germany was seen as the one who has the harshest rules to get rid of. And the left party, the only one for those who want to be open as we've been, as even the Green Party moved in a camp of more restrictions for refugees and asylum seekers. And therefore, I think that is an explanation for the growing results for the left, who 4 weeks ago have been seen below the 5% threshold. On the other hand, you have to see that Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, who finally achieved, I think, 4.985 or something like that, so very close to the 5% threshold, but below, is apart from the former left party with a right-wing asylum seekers approach, very difficult to understand, but it's not my problem. And even this party was able more or less to achieve this 5% threshold. And if you add them on top on the left, it shows that we got a radicalization on both sides, extreme right with AfD 20% and extreme left, if I count this Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, BSW, together with the left, more than, let me calculate, 13%. That is the fundamental problem, what we are confronted with, that we get more and more fragmentation in the center and more radicalization on both sides.
Gosh, that's quite a concerning picture then.
It is absolutely. And if you look to our neighbor, to Austria, where we had this already in the past, after the elections in Austria, and they still don't have a government there, the FPÖ, which is the extreme right party, there the Freiheitliche Partei is the German name, is number one, and there's now a second attempt to build a government between conservatives, social democrats, and liberals to overcome this largest group of extreme right wings. And that's our main concern, that things we see in Austria already now could happen in Germany as well. And that means we need now a stable government. We need very quickly a government, and we need a government which delivers to address these problems. But that's not the only problem, of course. We will come to defense, security, European cooperation, transatlantic relations. You spoke already in your introductory statement about that. But of course, we've been very shocked at the Munich Security Conference. I was joining this meeting when US Vice President J.D. Vance spoke about the main enemy is not China or Russia anymore. The main enemy is Europe. And he brought examples from the United Kingdom, from Germany, and from other states in the European Union. That means as well that we have to give answers on that. And we know on the other hand, as today we have this horrible Remembrance Day, 3 years of starting the war, Russia against Ukraine, that even that is put into question by President Trump, who has started this war. And that shows that we have to become more independent. And I think it's not a threat, it's a necessity.
Yeah, well, I tend to agree with that. Christina, let me turn to you. I mean, you've been watching the kind of UK-Germany relationship for a while. I mean, it seemed to me that since it took office last July, the Labour government has made a real effort to build bridges to Germany. And it built up a good relationship with the outgoing government. How do you think that the change of government in Berlin will affect that relationship? I mean, is it something where there is genuinely a consensus in Germany that there need to be better relations with the British? Do you think that there are some areas, I mean, for example, migration, where actually it might be easier now to find common ground on a tough line, or are there other areas where it may become more complicated?
If anything, I would think the relations are even going to improve, because I think Friedrich Merz might be even more nearer to Great Britain than Olaf Scholz has been. I think back to the Paris summit a few days ago, where Keir Starmer suggested boots on the ground in Ukraine, and it was Olaf Scholz who then went out early and said, well, I'm very irritated by this, and I think this is completely premature. Might be. But at least this was a signal that London had understood something has to change. And it was a signal to the Brits, to Europe, and to the US as well. And the first thing the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz did was criticizing this and saying that there's security just with the US. And this after the US had just thrown us out. So this means there is no security anymore. And I think Friedrich Merz will have a different approach to questions like this. He is bolder. You mentioned what he said yesterday evening after he was elected. I thought this was very remarkable as well. And he said, Europe has to become independent from the Americans. This is not the English approach, obviously, right now, with Keir Starmer trying to act more diplomatically and more cautious. But I think this was necessary as a signal to the Germans, who I fear haven't yet understood what is at stake right now. And I think it was necessary to say this, to give the impression to people that he really wants to have a bold approach to the new world order, to the tectonic shift we are living through right now. So I think what is happening now is the Zeitenwende Olaf Scholz once promised and didn't deliver. And we are really in a Zeitenwende now, for Germany, for the UK, for Europe, for the whole world. The USA is letting us down. We can be glad if they merely abandon us and not see us as adversary. Germany is up. What Friedrich Merz yesterday said shows that he got it, that he does understand it, that he does understand that Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, and others have just fired us, more or less. And this gives me hope that we Germans will soon embrace our role in the emerging new world order, alongside the EU and alongside the UK. So you're asking if the relations, so if there are areas in which relations will intensify. Yes, defense, maybe migration, but I think, and maybe even economy. I think nothing is off the table right now. So even trade could be becoming easier because everything is changing right now. And therein lies a chance as well for the reset the UK under Labour wants. The problem I see in the election result in Germany is that it gives us a new but not a strong government. Compared to their options after the collapse of the traffic light coalition, the CDU-CSU performed weakly. And it is somewhat under the radar as well that the AfD and the Left Party together could reach a blocking minority in the Bundestag. So whatever efforts the new government will take, these both parties would be able to block decisions like necessary funds for Germany's military build-up, and they are both nearer to Russia than they are to the EU. That's a chance. That's a risk I see as well. For even if the new government wants to act boldly, they can be stopped at some point. And then the CDU-CSU must govern now with the SPD. That's the coalition Friedrich Merz and in Bavaria Markus Söder have desired. But I think it has its pitfalls as well. In the past 27 years, the SPD has only been out of government for 4 years. In comparison, the CDU-CSU was out of government in this period for 10 years. So the SPD is a long governing party who shaped German politics. And German politics, I see it at least as this. German politics is too slow. It's not bold enough. It's too bureaucratic. It's too much into details and not in the whole picture. And the both parties in the many grand coalitions, quote unquote nowadays, in the grand coalitions we've had over the last decades, they were slowing down each other. They were quarreling. They didn't really show a unity in even very important questions and issues. And I fear that this might go on. And if this happens, then the government might end up early as well, as the last one did. And even if it lasts for 4 years, if nothing is going to change in Germany, and this is not only about migration, and it's not only about the Ukraine, it's also about trains not arriving, it's about the economy going down, many issues people see and suffer from and don't like and want to be changed. So, and if this government doesn't deliver this change, then in 4 years latest, we will have the AfD as the strongest party in Germany, for sure. And this is not fun at all, because, and this is about the mentality in both countries, as my last word maybe here, I love the Brits because they are so liberal. Life is so nice here. Even politics, you complain about your politics, it's difficult, but still you have a laugh sometimes. The Germans aren't laughing, and they tend to be really illiberal, and the AfD is, for reasons, the extremist party in Europe with which even Marine Le Pen doesn't want to deal with. So this is really serious. If Germany gets the AfD as the strongest party, we are in real danger. And this goes for Europe then as well. Sorry, I'm a pessimist, by the way.
Yeah. Thank you, I think. I'm not sure whether the fact that we can laugh at our politics is a good thing or a bad thing, but perhaps it's a good thing. Christoph, I alluded earlier to the impression that Scholz always gave that he wasn't really interested in the EU. Merz at least on the surface, perhaps is a bit more of a European. He spent one term in the European Parliament. In fact, like Markus, he was a member of the Economic and Monetary Committee. What sort of role do you think he will want Germany to play in the EU? And I wonder, you know, with Ursula von der Leyen heading the Commission, and Macron much weaker at home, what, you know, is there going to be a very German dynamic in the EU, sort of driving things forward in that direction? How, or might it change in some other way? I don't know what the relationship between Merz and von der Leyen is, whether they get on or don't get on.
I don't know either, although of course von der Leyen is a former ally of Ms. Merkel, and at least from that point of view, I'm not sure whether their personal chemistry needs to be very strong. But I don't know that. But I do know that they are in the same party, and also the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the European Parliament, David McAllister, is also a CDU member. So I think it's fair to say that Merz does have, as a result of being a former MEP, but also as a result of all the links that his party has, very strong personal links, and has engaged in a lot of dialogue in the last months with other European leaders. So in that sense, he's, I think, instinctively very interested in the European agenda. He's very interested in, as you have quoted, in finding solutions at the European level, because it's quite clear that when it comes to matters of defense, it can't be just everyone spending in an inefficient way on their own. There needs to be more cooperation. There needs to be an emphasis on defense industry and so forth. So I think there's a lot of resonance and openness and receptivity, both from the Brussels side as well as with regard to the CDU-CSU, for doing more with Europe, working very closely with the Commission, with the European Parliament, with other European leaders to make progress, particularly in the area of foreign security and defense. And I think that may become particularly important when it comes to questions of funding, because as Ms. Heuer has already said, there's a problem with the 2/3 majority that is no longer available potentially after, once the new parliament has been constituted. That would mean one of the ways out is through Europe, through borrowing on the EU level, to have that kind of big fund to, like the COVID-19 fund, to boost European security and defense spending. The other option would be to pass something with the old parliament, where you still have the 2/3 majority, but that would require some really emergency situation to emerge. I think the positive takeaway is clearly that Germany is able to, or might be able to act again, and Europe has been waiting for a German government to be present again at the table. So I think that is a positive thing. Clearly, Mr. Scholz was not as interested in setting a European agenda. He gave a couple of big speeches in Prague, but they didn't amount to very much. They were not properly coordinated. And I think his relationship with Macron was not a very good one, not a very collegial and cordial one, and therefore he didn't achieve very much on his European agenda. To be fair, I think one thing that this did distract him is management of his own coalition at home. And this will be a problem for Merz as well, that he will find himself stretched between the international arena, Brussels, and what is demanded from him at home. Clearly, Macron will be very happy with some of the comments that Merz has made about independence, because that, of course, boosts the open strategic sovereignty or strategic autonomy agenda that France has been keen on for a very, very long time. And there are big questions that need to be taken. Is this going to lead to some sort of a minimal de-risking from the US in terms of weapons, in terms of weapons purchases, in terms of space, technology, because otherwise it may be used against Europe under the current US administration? Or is there still space for some sort of patching up, kind of balancing, calibrating between the US and others? So I think the Zeitenwende is on track again. under a Merz government, so there will be a big movement. It's also, I think, noteworthy that you will have Mr. Pistorius probably at the front line. You will have Lars Klingbeil replacing the kind of very pacifistic pro-Russian, I mean, certainly a more friendly Mr. Mützenich as group chair. So I think there will be a lot of movement happening in this kind of exceptional moment for Europe and for Germany on the security and defense arena. I think for the UK-German relations, I also would see there are a lot of opportunities, but I think there will be difficult choices for Mr. Starmer, which will be interpreted very carefully by Germany as to what they actually mean. And I know Mr. Starmer always says we don't want to choose. This is a false choice, but I think it may well be forced upon him. And what are the risks? I think one risk is that we'll have another vote, namely the vote of the German SPD party members for the coalition treaty. If that is negative, there will not be a German government. So there's another vote coming, and that has been promised. So that would lead to a minority government with the Greens, or I don't know what might happen. So that's a risk. The second is that a lot of things will happen until a government is formed. That there's a fait accompli with regard to Ukraine, and Germany can't get its act together to put a counteroffer on the table for Ukraine. The third risk I see is that Merz is running into trade-offs with, for instance, the immigration agenda, that he's talking very, very tough on sending irregular migrants back, but is really creating a lot of havoc with his neighbors, creating problems with the Commission. So there's a bit of a contradiction, or at least a tension, between some of the immigration policies that Germany wants to enact under Merz, or Merz wants to enact, and kind of keeping the Europeans on board and finding a consensus around that. So I think these are my points. Thank you.
That point that you raise about SPD members having to vote, I don't know, anything about the makeup of that group. Are they likely to be difficult? I mean, are they? So, I mean, Labour activists don't always have precisely the same views as the government on a variety of issues, including relations with the EU. But, is the SPD likely to run into trouble? And are there certain areas where there might be a difference between the SPD leadership and the membership?
I'm not necessarily the greatest expert on the Social Democrats, and clearly it will depend on what the coalition treaty actually says, whether they think they are represented in the agreement or not. But clearly, I think also, as Ms. Heuer said, there will be people who will be deeply unhappy about the SPD going into yet another grand coalition, who have other ideas about where the government should go, and who are perhaps also happy about Mr. Pistorius and Mr. Klingbeil, who are of course much more hawkish on defense, to effectively kind of take the party in a direction that they may not be happy with. And of course, you can count on a lot of Russian disinformation and trolling of that election to make sure that it goes against the coalition agreement. So I would certainly not say it's a negligible possibility that they would reject it.
Okay, that'll be an interesting theme, I think, to explore. Marion, let me turn to you finally. I mean, I want to go back to Metz's remarks last night, because they really were remarkable, both in his comments about the US specifically, but also I think that he said basically that he had some doubt that NATO in its current form would exist by the time of the NATO summit at the end of June. If he really believes that, and this is an extraordinary thing to say, but if he really believes that, what would you expect him to do as Chancellor to reduce Germany's security dependency on the US? And what do you think specifically he might be willing or interested in doing vis-a-vis Ukraine to ensure that we do not end up with the kind of fait accompli that Christoph just mentioned?
So it's a really good question. I think one of the big challenges that he's going to face is essentially the timelines. I think one of the colleagues mentioned that the government would be formed by Easter. But of course, then we are also already a good 6 weeks or 2 months closer to the NATO summit. So if you really expect that NATO might look very different by June, then you essentially need to start acting now. I think in a way, a lot of these changes in German approaches to security policy follow on from the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Some of the changes have been quite slow, I think, especially in terms of public perception and the German public's understanding of the security environment having changed dramatically. The previous government has set in motion some of the legislative changes that needed to take place in terms of procurement policy, in terms of defense spending and so on. And that was one of the reasons why the previous government ended up falling apart. And so I think there are better foundations in place than there were a few years ago that a merged government could build on. But at the same time, many of the challenges unfortunately remain. The European defense industry remains relatively weak, despite having been strengthened. So I would expect to see much more investment in that area. And I think, as colleagues have pointed out, this is also one of the areas where a new German government could cooperate quite a lot with the EU, could cooperate quite a lot with the UK and with other European partners. But there are also much bigger questions around which other European countries would actually be willing to show up, especially if we're talking about a new security architecture that's not necessarily NATO, because while European NATO has been relatively cohesive over the last few years, there have, of course, been challenges within NATO as well, through countries such as Hungary, or Turkey has on occasion been a rather difficult ally. So if you wanted a strong European security community that wanted to strengthen Ukraine, that wanted to make sure that Europe was able to be more independent from the United States, then that would not necessarily look the exact same as the current NATO constellation minus the United States. And I think, once we speak about different kinds of arrangements, perhaps different contractual arrangements, then it becomes very difficult to get everyone at one negotiation table and work out modalities. So I think essentially the unpredictability and sort of instability that the Trump administration has introduced in that regard remains a huge obstacle for Germany, but also for Europeans generally. I think what's really interesting about this as well is that if there are concerns about a potential coalition government that might involve the AfD, as long as we take a security policy lens, that's pretty impossible, because those are the policy areas where I think there's the biggest divergence between the AfD and the more centrist European German parties. Whereas if we look at other areas, there's much more convergence there. And so I think what I would like to see from a potential government is to outline much more clearly, much earlier, what European partners can expect, so that we can make sure that Germany isn't sidelined when it comes to peace negotiations in Ukraine, when it comes to how to strengthen NATO, how to strengthen security and defense in the European Union. But as Christine pointed out earlier, I think those are exactly the areas that could fall victim to any negotiations about domestic policy priorities. And I worry that that's essentially going to continue to be the great challenge that the new German government is going to face, that any coalition agreement is going to have these huge tensions between divergence when it comes to domestic policy and much more alignment when it comes to foreign and security policy.
I just want to explore one thing that was mentioned earlier, which is this question of needing to get a 2/3 majority to, well, either to overcome the debt brake or presumably to pass a new special fund for defense. Is that right? So would you say that there is no possibility for a coalition to pick off enough members of the opposition to be able to overcome that obstacle? I mean, is it somewhere where, the opposition is bound to vote against either getting rid of the debt brake or voting through a special fund for defence?
I'm not sure if it's impossible. I think it depends exactly on what's on the table. My concern about a new special defense fund would be that some of the parties that are going to be in parliament see the current security environment very differently. So, the AfD does not necessarily see Russia as a threat. Die Linke is generally very pro-peace and wants the German military to look more like a defense force. I'm not quite sure what the difference would be between an offensive and a defensive German military, but I suppose it would mean less investment in military capabilities, which is not really the right direction given the security environment that we're in at the moment. And so I think I think it would be in their interest to block anything that essentially contravenes those kind of points. But if we're talking about, I think the debt brake was such a specific policy instrument that was also so closely tied to FDP interests, and they're not going to be represented in parliament anymore. So if we're talking about the debt brake specifically, then I don't think that would necessarily be an impossibility in the same way that some of the questions on security and defense might be.
Yeah, but the AfD is against it. Wants to hold it. So they have 145 members in parliament. So I think it just lies in the numbers.
Right.
They want to. So the Greens, for example, would go with the CDU on defense and foreign policies.
Yeah.
They are much stronger in this regard than the SPD is. But it could be just not enough members to vote for it in the end.
Yeah. So before I open up the floor, Markus, I don't know whether you want to comment on this. So are we stuck with the Schwarze Null for the foreseeable future, or is there a way around this?
Come on, that is the wrong discussion. The right discussion is what has been spent in the last years and why was there money available. For example, subsidies have increased from 30 billion to 67 billion in the last 3 years. The social aid has increased from 25 billion to 40 billion in the last 3 years. So there was a lot of money available for things which was in the interest of the traffic light coalition. And so I do not know why we will not be able to find the necessary resources in the years to come. And honestly, I do not see the advantage of a special defense fund again. If what we really need is a capacity building on the industrial side, and we will get this capacity building process in the European Union only if there is this possibility to see from the industry that the money will be available in the long run on annual basis. And that means it has to be financed out of the budget. Otherwise, when you see how the 100 billions of the special defense fund have been spent, 75% more or less went to the United States. The second largest amount went to South Korea for buying what is available on the market. But that is not what is needed in the long run. In the long run, we have to be able to produce what we need, that we have it available when we need it. And therefore, and that is something we spoke about the internal round organized by Hans Seidel Foundation as well a few months ago in Brussels with experts from NATO member states. This is one of the key elements, and therefore a special fund makes no sense. And all this mathematics of MPs who could move from one side to the other, forget it. There's no chance because the figures are very clear. CDU and CSU, and don't quote me that I want that, but you have to start with that. Plus AfD have a majority. We will never use it, that's for sure. But that means that no one else has a majority against CDU, CSU, and AfD. And why should we, as CDU, CSU, move out with some of our colleagues to an extreme left approach led by the Social Democrats with the Greens and the Communists? Sorry, there's no chance. That means the figures are as they are. There's only one option, and this only one option is with the Social Democrats. Of course, their rules say that at the end, the members of the party have to agree on a coalition treaty. But even the Social Democrats will understand if that will fail, there's no other option to build a government. And that means new elections. And the Social Democrats will not be the winner of a second term of national elections. So therefore, I think at the end of the day, and it will take a little bit of time, trust building and things like that, that we can agree on it. And the other truth is, I negotiated coalition treaties as well in the past. They are always a description of the reality at the time they are negotiated. But even 1 year later, you can forget about them. Take the last one, which was agreed in or finalized in December 21. And then we had the 24th of February 22. And everything in the coalition treaty was more or less ridiculous and not valid anymore, because the world has changed tremendously. And that has to be taken into account. And therefore, I appreciate the approach of Friedrich Merz not to speak about every detail, every semicolon, and every intent in a coalition treaty, but a procedure, how we can organize trust and confidence for a 4 years period, because that was the lack of the last coalition, and how we can address the problems which show up and we cannot agree at the moment as we don't know them. And therefore, I think this approach from Friedrich Merz is very sensible and very sophisticated. And even that will help that we can pass this through the members of the Social Democrats and the party organizations of CDU, CSU to have the agreement in force at the end of the day. I'm not so pessimistic. We know what has to be done. Of course, we have to bring our economy on the right track again. For the moment, we're stuck in recession. That's the main challenge in Germany, which has to overcome. Even that makes resources available. If we have the average growth of the European Union in Germany, we would have 20 billion euros more available, which means more tax revenues and less social costs. So therefore, it's not so difficult to organize all this stuff. And this black zero, which was in the time of zero interest rates, the right approach. Sorry, if you have to pay for your debts and you are not able to have a balanced budget, you really have a problem, a structural problem, and that we have overcome that is good and gives space and financial space for the years to come. So I'm very optimistic on all this stuff.
Okay, very good. All right. So you want to, okay, quickly, and then I really must open the.
I'm sorry, can I? So,
yeah.
Sorry, Mr. Ferber, you might not like the discussion on the debt break, but you're going to have it because the SPD won't let you out of it, and they won't allow you to take all the money needed from benefits. And you know you're going to have that discussion. That's one of the main points you're going to discuss with your new coalition partner.
Yeah, but you have to be aware, the Commission President made, even before the speech of J.D. Vance, the proposal to open the escape clause for defense spending. That is something to be further elaborated and discussed. I have not yet heard that here, but that is, of course, on the table as well, and that would go for Germany as well. And to change our constitution needs a 2/3 majority. That's very easy to understand. Who is able to organize a 2/3 majority can change the constitution. Who is not able to organize it cannot. And I don't see a 2/3 majority in the next legislative period to change the existing rulings. Because I couldn't agree more, forgot who said it, that the left will only agree for other purposes than to spend more for defense. And therefore, there are two possibilities. One is discussed already at the moment in Berlin, that the existing parliament, where it's easier to organize this two-third majority, could solve that, because as long as the new parliament has not constituted itself, the old parliament has the right even to change the constitution. We have we had a court case on that it is possible, only to look in my crystal ball what is possible. So we should be a little bit more with more ideas how to overcome these problems. There are a lot of possibilities available, and we are not stuck in a trap. I think everyone knows what has to be done, but we have to be careful that we use all possibilities, because then we are in another trap, which means higher debts on European level, new investing program like Next Generation EU on European level, releasing the fiscal pact, and more national debts. Then we will have problems, not in Germany, but in other member states, that they will have mistrust from the capital markets. So we have to find a balanced approach in between these possibilities on European and national level. And I think there's a lot of space, even without hurting our coalition partner in such a way that he will never agree on.
Okay. I think we'll probably explore this a bit more later. Okay, so let me open the floor for questions. Please state your name. If you're online, you can either raise your electronic hand and we will unmute you, or you can post your question in the chat and I will read it out. And I already have one question online, but I'll take one in the room if somebody. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Anna Matveeva, King's College London. I would like to return to foreign policy, if I may, and also related to domestic policy. What will happen to the previous line of different German leaders, Angela Merkel, the last one, that line, Ostpolitik? Is it now dead in water? Do you see any chances of revival of that in some future, or that's sort of completely gone? Thank you.
Okay, and I have half of the question that I have online is actually quite closely related to that. So this is from Faisal Islam, the economics editor of the BBC News. I'll come back to the other half of his question, but the bit that relates to yours is there any feasible domestic political pressure, if there is a peace deal in Ukraine, to repair or restart Nord Stream and the flows of cheap Russian gas? Is that an absolute non-starter, no going back, or could it be dangled as an incentive for Moscow? So I don't know who wants to tackle those two Ostpolitik related questions.
Yeah, I mean, if we think about the change in personnel with the Social Democrats, so Klingbeil for Mützenich and Pistorius for Scholz, that would seem to indicate to me that there are very few sympathizers for at least the kind of idealized version of Ostpolitik, rather than the real version of Ostpolitik, which was backed up by deterrence and strength. So I don't think the perception of Russia as a threat will change under the current government. What of course might change is that the US somehow manages to impose some sort of a deal on Ukraine, and the fighting will stop, and then there's some sort of a moment of realization, of humiliation, that Europeans can't do anything about preventing that from happening. What will happen under those circumstances, I'm not sure, but I personally don't think the new government, the new coalition, will give any reassurances from Putin, or perhaps even from Washington, any credibility. So I don't think they will trust whatever has been signed, and they will still expect that Russia will have another go in whatever it didn't get with the current treaty. So I think the underlying threat perceptions that drive German foreign security and defense policy will not change. I think they will outlast that. And about, I don't know, yeah, you want to take the
Sure. Yeah, I can comment on this as well. I think German Ostpolitik will really depend on the party we're talking about, and the exact composition of parliament and who has what voting power. I think especially with the changes in the SPD that Christoph mentioned, SPD, Grüne, and CDU, CSU are like fairly aligned on what Ostpolitik would look like. And I think it would be much more backed by a strong deterrence posture and a strong European or NATO deterrence posture. But at the same time, there is I can't say whether they're minority or majority, but there's a grouping within the business community that would love to go back to some sort of arrangement with Russia for access to Russian markets, for access to affordable Russian energy. And then, of course, if we look at AfD, if we look at Die Linke, and if we look at BSV, they all would also like to see some sort of return to Nord Stream. I think that it would be a really poor security step for Germany to take that step. I don't think that necessarily anything of significance has changed since in the last few years. That would mean that a return to Nord Stream would not also be a return to German dependence on Russian energy, and therefore a return to insecurity. So I would hope that essentially the way forward is much more investment in German energy security, European energy security, and focusing on using other instruments of pressure. And also Russia has diversified its energy exports in a way that I'm not sure that it would necessarily be a significant amount of economic leverage in the way that Germany would undoubtedly fool itself into thinking that it was, if it was to return to Nord Stream or similar energy deals. But I think if we're looking at the sort of centrist parties, their mindset has shifted significantly to the point where I'm not sure that we would necessarily return to energy politics or energy dealings in a way to try and influence the relationship with Russia. But there's, of course, lots of other aspects of German society that might feel differently.
If I would like, if I'm allowed to join in, I think the change by trade, the Wandel durch Handel German Ostpolitik approach was built on rule-based multilateralism, and we don't see this rule-based multilateralism at the moment anymore. Sorry. And that has to be taken into account. And it was not us or the Europeans who broke it. That happened somewhere else, maybe more in the West. But on the other hand, I'm a little bit concerned, and that was one of the discussions at Munich Security Conference as well. It's now 80 years after Yalta and 50 years after Helsinki, and sometimes even Munich, 1938, which has not an anniversary, comes into my mind. What world are we living? And our main concern is at the moment that is what Friedrich Merz reflected yesterday night, that we will come to a Yalta in Riyadh, that there are two big parts who are deciding who has influence where. And that's really concerning us. And therefore, the reaction can't be the good old Ostpolitik, because the good old Ostpolitik was built on the Helsinki process. And I don't see a revival of the Helsinki process at the moment. And that has to be taken into account. That's why, and I couldn't agree more, it's only extremes on the right and the left who want to re-establish the pipeline Nord Stream 2. And we should be aware of creating new dependencies from Russia. Germany paid a high price for that we've been so dependent, and we managed it very properly to get rid of that. You can blame the Javi coalition for a lot of things, but not for that. That was really properly done by this government. And so we should take care that the dependencies we still have in Central Eastern Europe can be overcome, because the main threat for the years to come will be Russia. Whatever will be agreed in Riyadh will create problems, to say it very neutral, for us in the years to come. because I think the hunger of Russia is not satisfied if they get some parts of Ukraine or can keep the Crimean Peninsula. And that has to be taken into account. So my concern is that we are more in a Munich 38 conference area than in a Yalta or Helsinki process.
Right. Nick, I had you first, and then I've got two at the back.
Thanks, Ian. I wanted to drag us back to the US. I recognise there's been enough of that already, but just to have a look at the way in which Germany conceives of its position. It finds itself in an era now of economic statecraft, and a capacity for economic statecraft is going to be required. One, how capable do you think Germany will be in performing in that sort of environment? And two, where does German strategic ambition and interests collide with the transactionalism required during the course of this government term? Is Germany capable of managing that medium to long term with the short term requirements? And what would you expect to see to give us confidence that that would be possible?
Okay, I'll take, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Greg Hans, former UK Trade Minister. And thanks particularly to Markus. Good to see you, Markus. A question, really a similar question about the relationship with the US, and specifically the relationship between Friedrich Merz and Donald Trump, which I think, to the best of my knowledge, I think is not a relationship that has ever, I don't think they've ever been in the same place. I may be wrong. But Markus, I wasn't sure your reading of the J.D. Vance speech was quite right when you said that you thought he was saying the enemy is not China or Russia, but the enemy is Europe. I think what he was trying to say was that Europe needs to sort out its enemy within, if you like, before it starts taking on, thinking about China and Russia, which I think is not quite the same thing. But my question really is this, which is, what do the panelists think about the Merz-Trump relationship? On the face of it, they might have more in common than one might think. They're both relatively older people for politics these days. They've both got obviously a business background, a US business background. And then a related question, could it be that Europe, if you like, is sending the wrong leaders to Washington this week, in Macron and Starmer, and might actually be better off sending Merz and Meloni to Washington to speak to Donald Trump? Have we got it the wrong way around? I know Markus will tell me constitutionally Merz is not the chancellor yet, but I don't think that prevents him from going. So I think the question, the Merz-Trump dynamic, how does that work?
Okay, and then I think it was on the back. Okay, I'll take you in the next round. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Bartek Staniszewski, Head of Research for Bright Blue. This is a question largely to Markus. Is it not possible for the CDU-CSU to form a minority government in the event that the SDP do not agree to a coalition and work to pass laws on a case-by-case basis? After all, it seems to me that coalition with the SDP was tried before many times, and that German voters are now looking for something more radically different than yet another centrist coalition.
Okay, I'll take you in the next round then. Okay, Markus, shall we start with you this time?
Yeah, I will try to be very short. Starting with the last question, minority government. Our constitution asks for a government which has a majority all the time, even in the relation between the first and the second chamber. And therefore, we are not used to minority governments. That's the easiest way to explain it, but the more truthful is our constitution does not foresee minority governments. And we saw it in the last months after the liberals have left or have been thrown out of the traffic light coalition, where we had a minority government, nothing was functioning anymore, with huge problems. And therefore, I don't see a possibility for a minority government, because who should support it at the end of the day? If it is AfD, then we will have discussions what we had already after a resolution in the Deutsche Bundestag. And on the other hand, it can only be minimum Social Democrats or Greens plus the left. I don't see that. And therefore, it makes sense to build a strong government. Greg, pleasure seeing you. Hope you are well and fine. And because I can't see you properly, you are from the camera point of view, you are sitting around the corner, but happy to have you here. I'm not so pessimistic about who is going to to Donald Trump, because I remember the Trump 1 administration where Macron invited Donald Trump to Paris on the 14th of July. And Trump was impressed by the celebrations of the French national holiday, and even got some ideas how to make this troop presentation at the mall in DC as well. He was really impressed. So there's a special relationship between those two. On the other hand, Mats has a long experience with the United States on economical basis, of course. Mainly, he was for years the chairman of the Transatlantic Bridge, which is an organization of companies based on both parts of the Atlantic, Germany and the United States. Very influential with a lot of contacts everywhere. So I think Friedrich Merz has its contacts necessary for do the job. But at the moment, we really stick to, firstly, you have to be in power and then you can travel for those things. And according to my knowledge, even the US protocol does not foresee to receive someone who is not in power yet. But that is not me to decide. That will be the decision of the White House. But I'm not pessimistic. On the other hand, what is most important, and that is what we organized in the Trump 1 administration as well, that we stick together. And as long as we stick together, as long we cannot be divided, I'm not pessimistic. And I think Friedrich Merz will play a very, very engaged role to keep Europe united against any attempt of the United States to divide us.
Yeah, I think Friedrich Merz yesterday evening has not endeared himself to Donald Trump with his remarks on the US. I think from their character, they are both alpha animals. That might be difficult as well. I think it's quite good that Macron and Starmer are going. Macron with his experience backwards, Keir Starmer with a view being just elected and staying for quite a while. But I still think the idea to send Meloni is very interesting because they get along very well. Obviously, Meloni just has been to the US, not speaking with Donald Trump, but at this Congress where Steve Bannon, I think, showed the Hitler boost. And she dared at least telling people so that she thinks the West must not be divided. So that was interesting. It hasn't been criticized much by Elon Musk or JD Vance or Donald Trump, and she obviously she's able to speak out some truths that the new US administration wouldn't like to hear from anybody else in Europe.
Yeah, perhaps a couple of quick thoughts. Statecraft, I think Germany can do statecraft. Certainly, the previous government demonstrated it when it needed to get LNG very quickly from Qatar and other places. So they can do it and they can move quickly if they want to, which was, of course, very costly, obviously. I don't think Germany will kind of do statecraft perhaps in quite the way as you suggest, because that would run counter to the idea of unifying Europe. You know, if this kind of the big man meeting up and dividing the world, I mean, that is not Merz's vision, I think. If he wants to unite Europe, you can't be seen as kind of cutting little deals in Washington. So I think it is about strengthening the EU and kind of acting through the EU, because together Germany will be stronger. I think I should just briefly remark on the speeches given in Munich. I don't think we should reinterpret them. They were fundamentally misguided and counterproductive what the US did in Munich, and I think they have supported the rise of the left in the German elections. They haven't benefited the AfD. And I think they really broke trust with a lot of Germans. And so this is not about Merz. This is about much broader. That this was perceived as something that was out of line to be supporting a right-wing party in that kind of way, and a perception that the US may not see foreign policy as kind of strategic foreign policy anymore, but as kind of through the lens of domestic politics, where everything European is seen as kind of, this is the Democrats, this is the opposition to be crushed or coerced in some way. So I think that is that maybe that can be repaired, but I don't think we should underestimate the damage that has been done through those speeches in Munich. And maybe one last thought on minority government. I mean, German history says minority governments in the late 1920s and 30s, that was the path to the NSDAP. So minority governments in Germany do not have a good history.
Thank you for that encouraging thought. Marion.
I agree with what's already been said, so I'll just quickly say something on the specific point about German strategic positioning versus the kind of transactionalism that a Trump administration might require. And someone earlier already mentioned the tension between needing to invest in better defense capabilities, but needing to do so at a time when European defense industry was quite stretched. And I think that is, of course, a challenge that the German government is going to continue to face. But at the same time, this is going to provide some opportunities for deals with the Trump administration, because the Trump administration has already outlined that it would, of course, love for Europe to continue to invest in US defense industry. And while the US defense industry is also not in as strong of a position as one might perhaps want it to be from the perspective of NATO altogether, it is in a much better position than a lot of European defense industry. So it would be possible to invest some of the defense spending that's going to be coming out of Europe in the US and to essentially buy US systems. I would, of course, want to see that done in a way that doesn't continue to increase European dependency, but at the same time, I think we're looking at a sort of a budget sheet of production numbers that doesn't really allow for European defense industry to immediately pick up all of the production that is required. And so that provides one opportunity to continue to engage with US government and perhaps work out a deal that continues to see the US presence in Europe in some way, while also increasing European defense capabilities.
Okay, very good. Right, next round, I've got Jill Rutter, David Hannay and Peter Watkins. So, Jill.
Okay, thanks very much. Jill Rutter from UK and Changing Europe Institute for Government. I want to be a bit more parochial than anyone's been to date. Does the change of government in Germany, change of leadership, make any difference to the prospects for the Brexit reset, relations with the UK, ambition in a defence and security pact, about which Markus seems quite positive, seem to be slightly critical of the EU in failing to do enough to keep the UK in the EU in the renegotiation? Does that mean he's got a sort of potentially more inventive view of what the future UK-EU relationship might look like, and potentially the opportunities for Germany, German exports to the UK, which I think suffered slightly after Brexit?
Okay, David Hannay.
David Hannay, House of Lords. Two questions. I mean, we're all taught by experts like you that it is impossible under the German constitutional system to have a single party government, or it's virtually unthinkable. So who's your candidate to help the AfD if they do rather well at the next federal elections? Because by definition, there'll have to be somebody if they're to form a government. And I don't quite myself see which one. I can understand why people use the argument to frighten the horses, but it doesn't seem to me to stack up terribly well. The second thing is, why is it that no one seems to have noticed that for 50 years, the 6 original members of the European communities and Britain had a Brussels Treaty pact called the Western European Union, which had stronger guarantees for mutual support than Article 5 of NATO, which was an integral part of NATO, so there was no contradiction, which did not raise the issue of strategic autonomy in purchasing, and which could undoubtedly be signed by most of the Baltic countries and quite a few of the East Europeans like Poland today, if it was allowed to lapse in the late 1990s because it was considered to be completely unnecessary. Why has nobody noticed?
I mean, do you think it should be revived?
I'm not thinking anything.
Okay.
I'm asking why nobody has noticed.
Yeah.
I'm in front of people who are meant to be students of history like me.
Yeah.
I was around when this was there for 50 years.
Yeah. Well, I shared an office with somebody who was notionally the UK's ambassador to the Council of the WEU.
Right.
Yes.
But the point is, if you look at the text of it, there's nothing objectionable in it. It doesn't undermine or weaken NATO. It coexisted with NATO for 50 years and nobody complained about it. And as I say, I suspect it could take on a lot more members. And if Mr. Orban chose not to be a member, too bad.
Yes. Okay. Interesting thought. Peter.
Yeah, Peter Watkins, formerly Minister of Defence. I mean, I have been around for long enough to remember the WEU treaty. I think one of the reasons why it disappeared, well, partly it was absorbed by the EU, but also a mutual defence clause backed by a very serious nuclear power like the United States is better than a mutual defence clause that isn't. And so I just wanted to come back to that, going back to what Friedrich Merz said last night about independence from the US. I mean, I can sort of understand why he said it. I mean, there's a lot of raw emotion around at the moment. But again, from a sort of rather old-fashioned British view, it feels a bit like self-fulfilling prophecy. I mean, the signals from Washington have been pretty rough over the last week, but they've also been quite mixed. I mean, if you read what HSF said, it wasn't all bad. And as Marion says, I mean, building sort of new European capabilities that are less dependent upon the US is going to be difficult and take time and cost a lot of money. And there is also an aspect that we don't like talking about, which is the nuclear one. Yeah. So I think we've got to be a bit careful that we don't talk ourselves into, being thrown out by our greatest ally, even if we're feeling rather cross with the person concerned at the moment. But the question I wanted to ask actually is very much related to Jill's, because there is a specific dimension of the, if you like, UK-EU reset, which is around the defence industry, and the fact that under current arrangements, UK-based subsidiaries of German or other firms, basically are not entitled to, bid for the money from the various EU funds that are being set up. Previous government in Germany said it was quite pragmatic about this, but in fact never really did anything. Italian governments also said the same thing and never did anything. And a certain government in a place called Paris, and we all know what they think. So I just wondered, does the panel think that actually Friedrich Merz-led government might actually invest some effort into doing something about this?
Okay.
Yeah, I find it quite just to start with this, with your point. So I think I can imagine this is going to happen because of the tectonic shift. So I think there is a chance as well that things can change rather quickly and in a pragmatic way. So I'm not a military expert. I don't know about these things very much, to be honest. So, but politically, I can imagine things happening that we wouldn't have thought possible 4 weeks ago. The AfD coalition partner just hasn't been voted into the parliament, but almost had been voted into it, and this is the BSW. Sorry to say that. I don't want to blame the conservatives in Germany to even thinking about something like this, but there might be parties that would, that would go into a coalition with them.
I guess
not many, but still not. It's still possible that they'll find someone.
I mean, can I just ask on that? I mean, the BSW feels like a personal vehicle for Saarland Connect. I mean, is it a party that is capable of getting beyond I mean, it obviously it didn't achieve as much as it had expected to this time, but those kind of personalist parties can either take off or they can disappear because there is only one person at the head of them. I mean, do you have any sense of whether she could collect a larger coalition of the unhappy?
I personally think it's good that she has failed this time around. No, to be honest, I don't know what is going to happen. So she is a very charismatic figure in German politics. She is married to Oscar Lafontaine, who has been this before for the SPD, who destroyed the SPD or damaged the SPD. Then went to the Linke and tried that. Then together now they try to destroy the Linke for in favor of the BSW. So that's in a way a never-ending story. I wouldn't rule out that this is going on for a while. And if I may just for later, I have a question to the Brits here in the round because I think. Somebody mentioned Kisama doesn't want to make a choice between Ukraine and the US. I would be very interested in your view if he had to make a choice for whom he would decide.
Okay, an interesting question. Christoph.
Yes, to Richard's question. I think there are opportunities for improving UK-EU relations and for the new German government supporting a closer relationship, whether that's on the economic side as well as certainly on security and defense, where there's a real need for the UK to support Ukraine, to support some sort of more independent European industrial capability for building up capacities and all the rest of it. So I think that is positive. And of course, CDU, CSU has always had strong links with the UK, and I think there's a lot of goodwill around that. I think the issue will be around how far can they go without undercutting the EU and the role of the Commission. For instance, the Youth Mobility Agreement. I don't think that is something that the new German government would suddenly say it's no longer important for Germany. But I do see perhaps some space around the European Defence Fund and some other European level instruments that these are opened up in some ways to create that European capacity, industrial capacity, and to have a real tangible sign that the UK is not just another third country and that it shouldn't be treated as such. So I think in that sense there is a real opening, but not perhaps not going as far. I would agree with I think Peter Watkins about perhaps not letting ourselves be talked into some sort of breakup and you get a war of words with US, and I think Mr. Merz and others have always said the Americans remain our friends. And we have all these links, there are so many links, transatlantic links at the business, at the political level, between senators, between the Congress and so forth. But it's still hard to get away from the impression that transactionism has morphed into extortionism and that there's this kind of shakedown diplomacy happening with it. So I think there's still a degree of willingness to wait and see whatever deal may emerge. But if it turns out that this deal is really disadvantageous to European security and German security, and if there's continued pressure on in support of the right wing in Germany, I think it will be hard for any leader in Germany to go back from that breaking of trust. And I think that's the intangible. Once trust really breaks, it's difficult to recover from that, even though on the rational level, you may see very strong economic, political, whatever incentives to collaborate. It's difficult then to think about worst case scenarios. What if the Americans did this? What if they did that? And then you get into the spiral of hedging, of duplication, which is costly for everyone. So rationally, clearly, one should repair that trust damage. And maybe one last word. There's of course Article 42.7, the mutual assistance clause within the EU, which has a very similar wording to NATO Article 5. But of course, at the moment, it hasn't really been used, and it's within the EU umbrella. But the real meaning is what is behind that clause? What is the political will, and what is the defense capability that stands behind that clause? So I'm quite sympathetic to looking at the history of those kind of alliances and kind of clauses.
Right. On the question of what this will mean for the UK and what it means for things such as the Trinity House Agreement, I'll just stick with my defense lens. I think, under a CDU-CSU government, the Trinity House Agreement is safe, is going to continue to be implemented as previously. There was a sort of Christmas visit of a German delegation to the UK that essentially said as much, that they were trying to ensure that there was as much continuity as possible on the defense agreements that were in place. And I think there's also the potential to do much more with the Weimar Plus arrangements, so with Germany, France, Poland, plus the UK, which would also be a fantastic show of leadership on European security from some of the biggest security powers in Europe. On alternative formats for European security, such as returning to a Western European Union arrangement, I think part of the reason why this hasn't necessarily come up as much in discussion is that even though the writing has been on the wall with regards to potential US distancing from Europe, the shape that took was still a shock. And I think a lot of people just have not wanted to think too closely and in too much detail about what that would take. The sort of unilateral arrangements that we have seen over the last few years, but also perhaps over the last sort of 5 years, might continue because they are more modular, they're easier to set up, and you end up with almost coalitions of the willing that take on certain security and defense arrangements that benefit them and that they are passionate about. Perhaps if the US was to withdraw more significantly from NATO or from Europe, we might see something more treaty-based, but I would expect that we end up in some sort of a uncomfortable balance whereby the US remains a NATO member, hopefully will continue to provide extended nuclear deterrence, but Europeans take much more responsibility for their conventional security. So I would expect to see much more, many more arrangements such as JEF or similar things that fix a specific problem rather than a bigger treaty. And then on the question about the defense industry reset and whether we might see more from Friedrich Merz, I would hope that we do, but I don't think we've seen that level of detail come out of any of his announcements. I mean, I think his remarks yesterday indicate that he would want to show much more leadership when it comes to these questions, and fixing the European defense industry challenge and making sure that UK defense industry is much more included in any potential solutions would be a relatively easy step on this, in my opinion. But I think we'll just have to wait and see how the details shake up.
Okay. Markus, you're going to get the last word. Just before I give it to you, I never got to the other half of Faisal Islam's question, which was whether there was likely to be any fundamental change in energy policy, especially on net zero and nuclear power. And I guess since it was Angela Merkel who took Germany out of the nuclear power business, it'd be interesting to know whether that is something that is likely to be looked at again. But yeah, please feel free to comment on other aspects of the last few questions as well.
I will make a short comment on that if you don't mind. But firstly, coming to the question which have been raised already, we will not be a partner for AfD at any time. Forget about that. And that's very clear conviction from CDU and CSU. On the WEO, most of it is incorporated in EU treaties. So therefore, we have a rule which is similar to Article 5. I think it's Article 45 in our treaties now, which is similar to the NATO Article 5. If someone is attacked, the whole European Union feels as being attacked. But we have to bring life behind that we are able to respond. And I think that is the main challenge. And there I see a lot of areas of cooperation with the United Kingdom, because especially in the area of defense, number one, we are both, or majority of EU member states and UK are NATO members, though there's a need for efficiency, and on the other hand, on the industrial basis, there's a lot of possibilities to cooperate there. So I'm very optimistic on that, and we should use that as a tool for a deeper cooperation, which then can be expanded to other areas as well. And on this energy issue, to be honest, number one, there is no company who wants to run a nuclear power plant anymore in Germany. And that is the mother of all questions. The state will not run these plants. And if there's no one who is doing or running such a nuclear power plant, it makes no sense to reinstall them. So that means we have to find other possibilities to address the issue. For me, number one is that we use these renewables we have available, and God gave us more than wind and sun. So we should use them. I live in an area where we have a lot of geothermy, which we are not using properly. We have mountains where water runs down, which we could use more and better. Austria shows us how that can be done. And even biomass is something where we have areas, even according to climate change, we will have more biomass. And even we should think on things like that, only to mention a few of them, and there are other possibilities as well. And of course, we have to organize a real functioning European energy market that is really missing, and that is demanded from our neighbors and from us as well. And I hope with the new commission we can have progress on that as soon as possible. But I don't see a new nuclear power plant in Germany, or a refurbished one of those who have been switched off of 2 years ago or 1 year ago.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, ladies and gentlemen, I think that's all we've got time for. I would like to thank our panelists. I think this has been a really rich, sometimes a disturbing discussion. Lots to think about and lots to look for as the coalition negotiations go on. But I would like very much to thank Markus Ferber, Marion Messmer, Christoph Meyer, Heuer, and please join me in thanking them.